This is Thursday, it's February the 16th, and my joy to come with today's Heart of a Shepherd devotional titled, Home, Not So Sweet Home. Now, our scripture reading, Genesis 33 and 34. Well, a little bit of an introduction, and we'll dive into the deep end of this study. Now, Jacob was glad to be free from servitude to his father-in-law, Laban. Now, after making peace, he departed from Mount Gilead in chapter 32, and then he journeyed west to the border of Edom, which was his brother Esau's land. Now, fearing Esau's approach, Jacob prepared his family for the confrontation he believed was inevitable. 20 years earlier, he had taken his brother's birthright, stolen his father's blessing through deception that had been initiated by his mother. Now, although 2 decades had passed, Jacob could not forget that fateful day he fled his home, nor the memory of his brother's threat to kill him. Well, in chapter 32, the news that Esau was coming with 400 men filled Jacob's heart with fear and dread. Now, verse 30, knowing he would face his brother the next day, Jacob spent the night at Peniel, and there the Lord met him, and we read, face to face, and promised to preserve him, Jacob, and his household. Now, Genesis 33. And Jacob and Esau's reunion. Well, as the sun rose the next day, Jacob bore a limp from wrestling with this angel of the Lord, who I believe was a theophany, the physical appearance of the Lord himself. Well, he would carry that limp the rest of his days. We read in chapter 33 and verse 1, that Jacob then lifted up his eyes, and he looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. It was then Jacob, divided his family in preparation for the meeting with his brother, not knowing if Esau's coming was for good or for revenge. In verse 3, as Jacob approached his estranged brother, we read that he bowed himself 7 times to Esau until he came near to his brother. In an instant, the bitterness and hardness that had separated these two brothers for 20 years was dissolved when Esau, we read in verse 4, ran to meet Jacob, embraced him, fell on his neck and kissed him, and we read, and they wept. In verses 10 through 11, the years and God's blessings, all both men had given neither cause for continuing their hostility. Esau graciously offered to accompany his brother on his journey as he was returning home. However, Jacob declined, explaining that his family and flocks would take a slower pace in verses 12 through 14. And then finally, bidding his brother to go on without him, Jacob agreed he would join him later in Seir. Jacob then traveled as far south as Succoth, built a house there, sheltered his livestock, and remained for about 18 months. Well, in verse 17 through 19, from Succoth, Jacob journeyed to Shalem, where he also bought a parcel of a field from a man identified as Hamor, and we know him as Shechem's father. Now, in verses 18 through 20, we find that Jacob built an altar. But don't forget, he had stopped short of his promise to return to Bethel. A decision that would cause him and his household, his family, much sorrow. Now, Genesis 34. I've titled this, To See and to be Seen, and a tragic story of love, revenge, and murder. Now, Jacob's choice to dwell in Shalem took a heartbreaking turn when we read about his daughter, Dinah, who was born to Leah. We read in chapter 34 and verse 1 that Dinah went out to see the daughters of the land. Now, though Jacob had purchased land outside the city and built an altar, it was not the place of God's choosing. And perhaps in some ways, Jacob was even oblivious that his children, they were not insulated from the fatal attraction of the world. Well, we find as we read through this chapter that the influence of the daughters of the land inevitably brought Dinah into the company of Shechem, the son of a wealthy, powerful Shalem man named Hamor. when Shechem looked upon Dinah, he seized her forcefully, we read in chapter 34 and verse 2, and he took her and he lay with her and defiled her. Now, though he had raped her violently, we read in verse 3 of chapter 34, the Hamor's soul clave unto the Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved, that sexually desired, the damsel, and spake kindly unto the damsel, that is speaking to her heart and her emotions, and then he desired to take her as his wife in verse 4. Well, the news of Dinah's rape reached Jacob, the father, but he held his peace, we read in verse 5, until his sons came home. Hamor, Shechem's father, came to arrange his son's marriage to Dinah in verse 6. However, her brothers were furious that their sister had been shamed and mistreated in verse 7. Hamor suggested a compromise, but such an agreement would have been a breach of Jacob's covenant with the Lord and put the promises of God in jeopardy in verses 8 through 10. And so Shechem pled for forgiveness, offered to pay whatever dowry was required, verses 11 through 13. And then plotting revenge, Jacob's sons agreed to accept Shechem as Dinah's husband. But watch now, verses 14 through 24. But only if the men of the city agreed to be circumcised. Well, unbeknownst to Jacob, on the third day after Shechem, Hamor and the men of the city were circumcised, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, drew their swords and they slew all the men of that city. Well, with the men dead, Jacob's other sons joined Simeon and Levi. They raided the livestock of the city, and they took the children and the wives of the city captive, verses 27 through 29. When Jacob learned his sons had deceived and killed the men of the city, he protested, for he feared their vengeful, murderous actions would have dire consequences for his households. Nevertheless, Dinah's brothers evidenced no remorse, and they challenged their father, asking, verse 31, should he deal with our sister as with an harlot? Tragically, I find the heartache and the division evidence in Jacob's household are often mirrored in our families. Realizing that no family is insulated from the world's sins, its sorrows, its violence, parents must be attentive, looking ahead, foreseeing the evil influence of the Hamors of the world. Don't forget, it was Jacob's inactivity, his unwillingness to do anything about the wrong that had been committed against his daughter and his household that provoked his sons to, in his stead, seek revenge. I close with a reminder of James chapter 4 and verse 4. Never forget, the friendship of the world is enmity with God. If you don't want to be an enemy of the world or find God your enemy, don't be a friend of the world. God bless you. Thank you for joining me for this devotional and challenge from the heart of a shepherd. God bless you. Bye-bye.